world's freshwater. Lake Michigan stretches over 300 miles and connects to 4 states. We're traveling down the Chicago River, which has 3 distinct branches that we're going to explore. Both of these bodies of water are prime waterways for trade. The Chicagoland area rests on the ancestral lands of many indigenous tribes like the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, who are part of a massive indigenous trade network. The word Chicago comes from the word jigagong, which is a beautiful word that means stinky onion. That's us. Take that, Big Apple. Our first permanent non-native settler arrived in the late 1770s. His name was Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. You'll see his name all over town. We got bridges, parks, even a museum named after him. He was a Haitian Creole immigrant who came to Chicago from New Orleans and set up a trading post where Michigan Avenue meets the Chicago River. And from that trading post over 200 years ago, we are here today. We are a city known for our prime geographic location as the railroad gateway to the west. We're a city known for our massive Union stockyards as the hog butcher for the world. We're a city known for our innovative architecture and technology, like the world's first skyscraper. Chicago is historically a town of innovation. Some fast facts about Chicago: we're the 3rd largest city in the US behind New York and Los Angeles. We have over 200 distinct neighborhoods on the north, south, and west side. There is no neighborhood on the east side because that is Lake Michigan. Each neighborhood has its own food scene, entertainment, culture, and it is worth hopping on the L to explore. L is short for elevated, and it's our transit system here in Chicago that residents use. I'm sure we'll see plenty of L trains go by on our tour today. They are super loud and not subtle at all. 8 different L routes will take you all over the city, which is pretty cool. All right, we're a small but mighty group, and we're gonna do something super dorky, which is, on the count of 3, we're gonna give a big wave and say, "Hi, Chicago." Once we're on the other side of this bridge. Don't leave me hanging. It's so embarrassing when I do it by myself. 1, 2, 3.
Hi, Chicago!
Thank you so much. It would have been really awkward if it was just me. Now that you've been formally introduced, I'd like you to meet. On your left, we have these 3 towers of increasing heights. That is one building called St. Regis. St. Regis is one of the newest super tall skyscrapers here in Chicago. It's from 2020. It is 3 towers of increasing heights that utilize step-like setbacks to create a wavy effect. In the daylight, you'll be able to see that the facade uses 6 shades of blue-green glass. It's very pretty. What's really interesting about St. Regis is that it uses all 3 of the anti-sway techniques we're going to talk about on this tour. They've got all 3 in this building. The first is a bundled tube structure like the Sears Tower, which we'll talk about when we get to that building. It has inertial slosh dampers or big water tanks, which we'll talk about. Those are similar to the ones at 150 North Riverside. And the third is that section of the building on that 3rd tallest tower that looks incomplete. Looks like 2 rows of windows that are open. That's called a blow-through floor. It's 2 open floors that help relieve the pressure of the wind and allow for a safe amount of sway. It was not a part of the original design for St. Regis, but there was still too much sway, even with that bundle tube and those slosh dampers. And so it was added, but it did cost them 2 floors of prime, expensive real estate. St. Regis is partly hotel and partly condos, and the top 2 floors sold as a combined penthouse for $20 million. Woof. That is the tallest building in the world, designed by a female architect. Her name is Jeannie Gang. Jeannie Gang runs Studio Gang, a design firm here in Chicago. We also have Jeannie Gang to thank for this next building. Coming up between this triangular shaped building and the James Hardy, you can see a taller tower with some crazy looking balconies. That is Aqua Tower from Jeannie Gang in 2009. It's recognizable by its balconies covering the exterior of the building, which give the impression of waves cascading. Each balcony is entirely unique in its design. This allows residents to better connect with neighbors above and below, but it also helps minimize wind shear and prevents birds from colliding with windows. Aqua Tower helped Jeannie Gang win the 2011 MacArthur Genius Grant. It is now the second tallest building in the world, designed by a female architect, which is very cool. Coming up, rising above, or actually, before we get to that beautiful building, we'll talk about the road in front of it. We got Michigan Avenue. That's Michigan Avenue Bridge right ahead. Michigan Avenue connects to the Magnificent Mile, which is our shopping district here. Anybody been shopping at the Mag Mile yet? Maybe? No? That's okay. I recommend checking it out if you haven't. Ton of fantastic, swanky places. Over 450 retailers like Louis Vuitton, Gucci, Cartier, but my personal favorite is the Lego store. It's also where our second dock for shoreline sightseeing is located. Pretty cool. And now I'm going to talk about that very well-lit and beautiful building. Coming up, that's the Wrigley Building and its clock tower. That clock tower was modeled after a cathedral in Seville, so we call this style of architecture Spanish Revival style. The Wrigley Building is from 1924. It's clad in 250,000 terracotta tiles and 6 gradient shades of white and cream designed to draw the eye upward. These tiles are for decoration, but are also a great example of fireproofing, something that is super important to the city of Chicago. But I'll talk more about that later. It's a real busy night out here on the river, especially post-fireworks, so bear with us. Coming up, we got the second tallest building in the city of Chicago, and it is wearing a name tag. That is Trump International Hotel and Tower. It's from 2009. It's from renowned architect Adrian Smith, who began his career here in Chicago with the firms Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, before going on to design the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. This is our first great example of Chicago being in conversation. This building is built in the architectural style of contextualism, meaning it has a relationship to its environment. This is represented in the 3 patio setbacks that correspond to the heights of nearby buildings. The Wrigley Building, AMA Plaza, which is a little black box number around the corner, and upcoming Marina City. A fun fact about this building is that it was featured at the ending of Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. Batman and the Joker face off in a construction site, which was, at the time, an unfinished Trump Tower, which is really cool. So that was used as a filming location. We have a ton of TV shows and movies filmed here in Chicago. I'll highlight a couple of them on the tour today. But real quick, I want to shout out Home Alone, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Blues Brothers, The Fugitive, The Sting. As for TV shows you can't miss, Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, Chicago PD. And one of my favorite shows that just dropped a new season, The Bear. Anybody has seen that show? Features a lot of fabulous Chicago restaurants. So if you're looking for a cool recommendation, that's a show to check out. Coming up on your right, we have the iconic pair of corn cob towers. It's called Marina City. It's a city within a city, designed by Bertrand Goldberg in the 1960s. When these were put up, they were the first post-war high-rise residential complex in the United States, and is seen as a catalyst for the residential building boom that swept through the downtown area. When these were put up, there was really no infrastructure down here for residential living. However, Goldberg wanted to change that. He wanted to attract people to the city center the way they do in European cities where he had studied. And so he constructed this vertical, self-sufficient corncob like utopia on your right. Like I said, it's a city within a city. Inside you can find restaurants, shopping, a grocery store, a movie theater, a bowling alley, a music venue, a gym. Talk about amenities. You would never need to leave. It's an introvert's paradise. My personal favorite is the 18 floors of parking, valet only, which valet seems like it's for the best. I once hit a parked car at the airport parking garage, so this is my high stakes parking nightmare. Cars only ever gone over the edge and into the river twice. Once was for a stunt in the Steve McQueen movie The Hunter, and the second was for a very creative car insurance commercial. Jumping to your left, we have a beautiful glass tower topped with what looks like a Greek temple. This is another great example of Chicago being in conversation. It's in the neoclassical style, meaning it draws from new and old. It's called 77 West Wacker. It features white granite exterior columns and sheets of blue glass reflecting the sky and river. It's the only building on our tour designed by an international architect. His name was Ricardo Bofill. He was from a family of architects and designed his first building at the age of 17. While I was doing it at 17, I was wearing a lot of eyeliner, so that's very impressive. Jumping over to your right, we have the Reed Murdoch. Example of prairie style with its warm brick facade and flat horizontal shape. This building is asymmetrical. There's one less bay of windows to the left of the clock tower. You can count them if you don't believe me. The city widened LaSalle Street in the 1930s. The building was in the way, so their solution was to chop off a whole bay of windows and drive me crazy 100 years later. That building is currently the headquarters for Encyclopedia Britannica. In case anybody was wondering, those guys are still active. We're gonna jump to the other side. For a great example of Chicago in conversation with itself, this is the Builders Building. About 2/3 of the way in, there's a vertical black stripe of windows. To the left is the original section of the building from 1927. On the right is a newer section built 60 years later in 1987. The architect of the newer section honored the original intentions of that first architect. In this way, the Builders Building is a beautiful blend of old and new. We're about to cross underneath the Wells Street Bridge. This bridge is an exact replica of the original Wells Street Bridge, which stood for over 90 years. This bridge is from 2013. Coming up on your right is Merchandise Mart. I'll talk a little more about this building in detail later when we come back through. But for now, I want to talk about this art show we see happening. It's called Art on the Mart. Once the sun goes down, giant works of art and light are projected onto the entire 2.5-acre face of Merchandise Mart. What's really cool about that is that if you look across from Merchandise Mart, you can see that black box that's full of projectors. Those projectors use a digital laser mapping system to make sure no light shines directly into the windows of this building. It's only on its outer surface. This fantastic light show. Art on the Mart happens every night through December at about 9 p.m.-ish. It's definitely a very cool and unique thing to check out. It's the world's largest display of projected public art, which is fantastic. we are headed now into Wolf Point. Wolf Point is the meeting spot of all the branches of the Chicago River. It's also a newer spot down here for construction. Most of these buildings were not here a decade ago. For example, we have on your right Salesforce Tower, a commercial office building from 2023. It's part of a trio of new buildings built on land leased by the Kennedy family. So this whole area over here used to be a parking lot. It's kind of crazy. I'll bring up the Kennedy family again later. They have a couple properties down here. Kennedy as in JFK kind of Kennedy. Is there another kind? All right. Coming up. Straight ahead, that's River Point, the building rising above that striking red sculpture by Santiago Calatrava. That sculpture is called Constellations. River Point is from 2017. It's the building with those double parabolas. That building's affectionately referred to as the Hot Pocket Building. It's also been compared to a McDonald's apple pie box. Just kind of cute. All right, coming up. This is 150 North Riverside, or the Pencil Building. It's from 2017 from Getch Partners, who found a creative solution to kind of a big problem. You see, the back 2/3 of the lot house active Amtrak train lines, and the front of the lot along the river has to contend with a zoning restriction that requires all new construction be set back at least 30 feet from the river's edge. So this left 39 feet for Getch Partners to build the base of a massive skyscraper. How do you keep an extra tall building in the Windy City from blowing over when it has a teeny tiny base? Called inertial slosh dampers. So at the top floor of the building, there is 160,000 gallons of water in 12 tanks. When the wind sways the building one way, the water in the tank sloshes the other way to counteract it. It works as like a giant shock absorber, which is pretty cool. Coming up on your left is Bank of America Tower. Their solution to that 30-foot setback restriction is a tripod setup that launches the third floor into the air. Bank of America Tower is from 2020. It took 3 years to build, and it cost about $800 million. So, how do we get to this super sleek contemporary construction like Bank of America or 150 North Riverside or River Point? Well, we can find the answer in the South Branch of the Chicago River. In the next few minutes, we will span 100 years of architectural evolution in the Windy City and see how the architecture here has responded to what was going on in the world. So, up first is 2 North Riverside Plaza on your right. It's 1929, the Roaring 20s, and Art Deco is all the rage. We'll talk a little more about Art Deco in detail later, but notice beautiful repeating patterns, polished limestone. Art Deco really only lasted the second half of the 1920s. Once the Great Depression started, construction on new buildings halted. Then with World War II and all its devastation, Art Deco, with its flashy, optimistic ornamentation, became a representation of a time gone by. A symbol of what once was. Chicago and the rest of the world had to take some time to really process and recover from World War II. And it wasn't until the late 50s and early 60s that architecture started to return. It was a cautious, dip your toes in the water kind of return, but modernism was born. And we have a German transplant to thank for that. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe introduced Chicago to his black box modernism style, which is on display in these 2 buildings to your right. Gateway Center 1 from 1965 and Gateway Center 2 from 1967. Their design is simple, functional, and most importantly, frugal. So, with this cautious optimism returning in architecture, the 1970s were ready to push the boundaries even further. 1970 said, "We see your black box modernism style and think we can do better. We raise you white boxes." And they really did. That is Gateway Center 3, a great example of international style. It's similar to black box style, but it now features sanded concrete and stone to really lighten things up. The boxes could be white, gray, brown. Options are endlessly neutral. It's called international style because the idea was that you could find this building anywhere in the world and it would still make sense. You probably have a building like this in your nearest city. By the time we hit the 1980s, we actually do get a bit bolder and funkier in our design, as represented in Gateway Center 4 from 1983. Also on your right, it's our transition into postmodernism and contextualism. It's kind of whimsical, but it still finds a way to incorporate itself into its environment. The curve of the building is an imitation of the upcoming curve of the river, and the glass matches the river's color. For the whimsy on this building, all of the glass is bubble glass, meaning that the center of each pane bubbles out. It makes reflections on the building look like reflections on the water's surface, which is pretty cute. So that's roughly our kind of 100 years of architecture tour within a tour. And in it, you can see how the architecture in Chicago has responded to what was going on in the world and how cultural attitudes can influence design. It can also impact the building's purpose, as we'll see with this next building that's coming up, this giant Art Deco style building. That is the old Chicago Post Office. It is from 1932. And at the time, it was the largest post office in the world. In order to accommodate Chicago's epic retail industry. Chicago is home to retail giants like Marshall Fields and Sears Roebuck, which made Chicago the mail order capital of the world, hence the massive post office. But as the world changed and digitized and shopping habits evolved, we really didn't need a massive post office anymore, and it closed its doors in 1996 and didn't reopen until 2019 after a $500 million renovation. It is now home to a number of company offices and headquarters like Uber, Walgreens, and PepsiCo. So that is our great big former post office. I like to say Chicago is a city of greats. Great food, great sports, great people, great architecture. And as we near the origin site of a not-so-little fire that toppled the town, Chicago is a city of great disasters. I'm talking about the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. We're going to enter into our story time section. I'm going to tell a couple of stories. Then we're going to eventually turn this boat around for some more architecture down the South Branch. But for now, buckle up for some stories. Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Let me paint the scene. It is the evening of October 8th, 1871, and Mrs. O'Leary is milking her cow Daisy before turning in for the night. Some hours later, a neighbor alerts Mrs. O'Leary to a fire in her barn. This fire quickly spread north and east into the heart of Chicago's business district, where it burned for over 24 hours until the morning of October 10th, when rainfall, along with firefighters' efforts, were finally able to extinguish the inferno. 17,000 buildings were destroyed, and 1 in 3 Chicago residents were left homeless. You're probably wondering how the fire started, or maybe who started it. If you think I'm going to blame Mrs. O'Leary and her cow, you're on the wrong tour. After the fire, everyone began pointing fingers at Mrs. O'Leary and Daisy, saying that somehow Daisy must have kicked over a lantern that set the barn ablaze. Chicago was even dubbed the city a cow kicked over. However, the journalist who first blamed Mrs. O'Leary admitted on his deathbed that he made it up. But not before Mrs. O'Leary spend the rest of her life tied to the fire that had leveled so much of Chicago. It wasn't until 1997 that the city of Chicago officially exonerated Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. But at that point, it was a little late to clear up Daisy's public image. Alright, so wasn't Mrs. O'Leary and her cow? Then who? Well, scientists have suggested it was actually a meteor shower that set it off. And the conditions for a fire were ripe too. Chicago was in a dry spell, and the architecture of the time, it was not steel and concrete. No siree. It was all wood buildings, wood streets, even wood sidewalks. So even though this fire took out the young original Chicago, it did leave a beautiful blank canvas for architects to flock to in order to rebuild. And rebuild they did, but this time with some improvements. Improvements like less flammable building materials, like the terracotta tiles on the sides of the Wrigley building. But even cooler, we get the world's first skyscraper, thanks to William Jenney. It was his idea to put the weight of a structure onto an inner steel frame rather than a load-bearing stone wall. And so, buildings were built, Chicago began to heal, and the second city emerged. We're called the second city, not because we're a runner-up to New York or LA, but because we are literally the second city built on the ashes of the first. So, 22 years go by, and Chicago was feeling pretty good. So good, in fact, we put in a bid to host the 1893 World's Fair, and we won. The World's Fair was a beautiful debut of the city of Chicago to the rest of the world. 27 million people from 46 countries came through the fair's turnstiles in those 6 months. Daniel Burnham was the architect placed in charge of the World's Fair. We'll talk a little more about him later. In Jackson Park, where it was held, some items we love debuted for the very first time, like shredded wheat, Cracker Jack, PBR, the L Train, the Zipper, Wrigley Gum, the dishwasher, and the Ferris wheel. Ferris wheel is perhaps the coolest debut, designed by George Ferris. It carried 2,100 passengers in 36 cars the size of buses, carrying about 60 people in each. But I'm scared of heights, so my favorite debut item was the brownie. Mrs. Bertha Palmer of Palmer House Hotel fame instructed her chefs to create a cake that was dense enough for fairgoers to eat as they walked about the grounds, and thus my favorite food was born. All right, we're gonna travel a little bit further down the South Branch. I'm gonna hop off the mic for just a few minutes, grab a little bit of water. Please visit restroom or bar on board. Enjoy that. And I'm gonna be right back. Talk a little bit about what we're gonna see down here, and then jump back into a few stories. All right, see you soon. Thank you.